Hello all. Well, my last video had a question on it. Let's go look at it. Well, he wants to know what I think will happen in the next 20 years. Well, I can tell you what's going to happen very shortly. Here's just some of the examples that out of many. 1/4 of all the honeybees in the U.S. died last winter. If we lose all the honeybees, we lose our lives. Honeybees are pollinators, and there's not nearly enough people to pollinate manually all of the grains and the flowers and the plants that we need to eat. This of course is unprecedented. Well, let me show you another item about this that helps me do a prediction like this. So this is another chart that we have to look at. This is the CO2 count. Alright, this goes back to 450,000 years ago, when the CO2 level, we pretty much know, was 280 parts per million. Alright, then soon after that it crashed down to almost zero, 350,000 years ago. Then it reached the all-time high of 325 parts per million in a very short time. Then it went right back down again. By 250,000 years it was back down to almost zero, or below 100. Then it shot back up to 290 or 289, somewhere in that area. That's around 280,000 years ago. Then it went down 200 parts per million, and came up to 245 parts per million, and that's in the 200,000 years ago. Then it crashed, and 150,000 years ago there was hardly any CO2. That means the Earth was very cold, and the CO2 was all locked up in the ice. Then we warmed back up about 100,000 years ago to 280 parts per million. Then we slowly, over time, came down to almost 50 parts per million. It was really cold. Now, you ask, well, what does this have to do with your prediction? This is what has to do with my prediction. Let me show you. The Industrial Revolution started. CO2 started to creep up and up and up. It reached 260 in just no time at all, surpassing 300, 325. So we're now past the all-time high of CO2 count in the last 450,000 years. But that wasn't it. It just kept going up and up and up until it's reaching 400.33. Just add a bunch of threes on there. So it's almost 401 parts per million of CO2. Now remember, the heat that comes with this CO2 comes about 5 to 10 years later. So once you get to that point, in the next 5 to 10 years, you're going to be seeing some of the highest levels of temperature this planet has seen in the last 450,000 years. Let's go talk about one other thing, and that has to be, I have a friend that works in one of the marine mammal rescue centers here in the San Francisco Bay Area. The marine rescue centers all around the world are seeing record amounts of dead and dying sea animals, whales, porpoises, walruses, and seals. Apparently it's a food problem. They're all emaciated, starving to death. The reason they say that the animals are dying here on the west coast of the United States and Canada and Alaska is because of Fukushima radiation, both in the water and the air, is poisoning the fish, which is what we've been seeing in the last several months, are all these fish die-offs all over the world. Because there are so many fish die-offs, and remember, out in the ocean, most animals sink to the bottom of the ocean, so you don't see all the carcasses. But if you were to go out in the Pacific Ocean, I think you would see just carcass after carcass if you were diving at the bottom of the ocean. So we have that going on. We have a major die-off around the planet. That's why I say in 20 years this whole thing will be over. It's looking like in the next 2 to 3 years we're going to see an economic crash that will rival that of the Great Depression, if not worse. the U.S. government and other governments around the world are QEing themselves into huge debts. Let me show you just the U.S. debt alone. So that, the environmental problems, and of course World War III, which is trying to get started. At the moment, Putin has backed down some, and the U.S. has shut their damn mouth for a change. Over in England, they're getting ready to pick new leaders, and the parties that are being thrust out there for the people to swallow, of course, are going to win. One of these scummy, shitty parties. They're not looking at the alternative Green Party or any of the other alternative parties. They're under the illusion that it makes a difference which one wins. As I said in last video, they all connected at the butt end of hell. So in 20 years, I suspect that humans will be far less humans than there are now, both because of climate and because of world war and because of food shortages and overpopulation and terrible management of our debt in our countries. It's all going to come down to a gigantic mess very shortly. Now, this prediction is sort of weird because I've predicted things like this before. Back in the 60s and 70s, we had a revolution going on here in the U.S. And at that time I said, we'll never make it past the year 2000. And then the year 2000 came, and we're still here, and we're still here. So maybe in 20 years it won't look much different than it is now. But from what I'm seeing and I'm studying, and including peak oil, or the lack of oil and natural gas, coal, steel, copper, and other natural resources that we so vitally need to survive, I'd be really surprised to see us go another 3-4 years without a major calamity and a population reduction on this planet. Here's just one more pot to throw in there, is why I think that the end is starting right now. Let's just take another example of the European gas shortages. They have to figure out how to get heating oil and heating gas into the UK and Europe before the cold weather sets in. Russia's cutting it off because of the nonsense. Don't blame them. So you can really see the tensions around the world are getting riled up over supplies, especially oil. You know how that one is, gas and oil. That's the big one that could end us all. And then during this war, if any of the nuclear energy plants get bombed, well, that's another, for sure, dead end for us. And I know that sounds gloomy, but you have to go by what the science shows you, and the science doesn't show very well. In fact, everywhere we look at science, every single direction is a downward trend, and it's just looking more bleak, and the sheeple aren't going to vote for a progressive, non-party type candidate. They still think the corporations are the way to go, and that we must protect our corporation. In my opinion, protecting the corporations is why we're in the situation we are now. The corporations have one thing in mind, and that's to make a profit. It's in the law. They have to try and make a profit. So in its nature, the corporation must grow every year in a finite environment. Doesn't work. Everybody knows that. People keep supporting these corporations by putting their money in major banks instead of credit unions, going to the big corporate box store to buy their food that comes from China, which means that their environmental footprint is bigger than most others, instead of supporting farmers markets, small health food stores, that sort of thing, and keeping the money in their own community instead of letting it go over to China or India or some other country instead of your own. So anyway, that's where my prediction comes from. And I hope it isn't too gloomy, but what is, and that is what is. I've shown you charts and told you about just a few of the major problems that are happening on the planet. So it's just, it is what it is. And I surely appreciate the comments and the new subscribers and all the ups and downs and everything else. So until next time.